Welcome to Call and Response. I'm Baron Vaughn.
I'm Open Mike Eagle. That's my name.
Yes, today I'm playing the role of Call. I think you'll probably be Response, right?
I was hoping there was some other role available, but I will take response in a
Well, we
pinch.
we can't be a vaudeville team without a catchy, kind of something and something kind of name. Call and Response, I think, does it. You
That
don't think
works for
so?
me. I mean, it's
All
already on the graphic, so I can roll with it for sure.
right. A graphic we made and agreed upon. That's true.
Hmm.
Um, Today is a fantastic episode, as has been true out of every other episode I think that we've been doing so far. I hope you've enjoyed it. Again, shout out to Funny or Die and Blavity for helping us put this whole thing together.
Absolutely.
So, yes, it's Tuesday, and what are we talking about today, Mike?
Well, we've been
Mm-hmm.
talking a lot of black shit, right? Every day, pretty much the
Yes.
whole show is us talking to black people about black shit,
Yes.
and we're going to continue to talk about black shit, but
Mm-hmm.
we're going to bring in some white people to talk about black shit with.
Because there is the argument to be made that there would not be black shit if there wasn't white shit.
Hmm.
So we're going to talk to some white people, white presenting people. I don't even know what all the correct things to say are, but that's kind of what we're talking about today, right?
Yeah, I think it'll be kind of informative for us too.
It'll be very informative because it's my belief that the work of whiteness, if you will, is to be done by white people, right? So I think that this is what's one of the things that's happening right now is that white people en masse are sort of, I hate to say waking up, I hate to say becoming woke to what they have haphazardly co-signed onto, you
Mm.
know, the sort of the identity and the structures of whiteness. And people are also waking up to, white people, I should say, are waking up to um, how it has been embedded in the law and the history for so long in a way that has done nothing but continue to erode this country, right?
Yeah.
And of
Yeah.
course, oh, go ahead, Mike.
I'm sorry. I'm just saying, you're right that it does feel like an awakening in that sense because so much of what we've been hollering about all our lives and our parents hollered about and their parents hollered about, and usually our hollering has been us standing in the middle of the street with only ourselves yelling at white people to pay attention. But if you look at protests now, there are so many different kinds of people. There are so many
Mm-hmm.
white people there,
Yes.
side by side with us, yelling about the same issues. And as great as it is to see that coalition, gosh, it feels a little odd sometimes.
It feels odd because obviously there's historical amounts of tension, you could
Right.
say. There's a lot of history to still be unpacked, but I think what, for me in my lifetime, what's unique about this moment is that people are willing for the first time, to
Mm.
really kind of approach these subjects. And we've been talking a lot about, obviously, white people that we have in our lives that have been reaching out to us,
Right.
you know and I got to say, most people are annoyed, right? You're kind of,
I just think it's a little weird, but I'll tell you more about it in a sec. What were you saying?
well, one of my, and I think I've said this before, one of um my wife's least favorite qualities about me is that I have an unending capacity for other people's bullshit, right? So yeah, I've had a lot of white people reach out to me. It doesn't really bother me that much. You know why?
Why is
Because I'm
that?
I'm willing to talk about it for real. I'm really
With
I'm
you willing to talk about it with each and every person who reaches out to you?
Yes, because I don't think they're all going to stay. You know what I'm saying?
Uh huh.
They're not all as down as they claim. And I think
True.
that this is the only way for me in my real life to figure out who's really down for this conversation. You know
Mm,
what I mean? Because that's what a friendship is. That's what compassion is to lead someone toward the truth, right?
that's real.
So anybody that's unlike me that has a perspective or life experience that I don't understand, I'm ignorant. I hate to make this comparison, but there's always people going like, "Well, I'm not racist." I'm like, "Of course you're racist. You're American."
Right.
You know? And I
You're at the
always say
very
like,
least prejudiced.
exactly. That's like me saying I'm not sexist. Of course I'm sexist. Of course I am. I'm a straight dude in America.
Yeah,
They've
it's
been
it's
beating
kind
me
of
over the head.
it's kind of
What's
in
that?
the stew. It's kind you can't really be apart from it. You could just try to overcome it and understand it as best you can.
And the first step to understanding it is admitting that that's been your training. That's the way that you have been taught to see the world.
I
and
guess,
trying to understand it and untangle yourself from it, right?
yeah, but for me, I don't feel like a lot of the people reaching out to me are friends in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of what makes it odd to me is that these are people that I may have worked with or,
Mm.
people who I am casually connected to in some form or fashion. But most of them, the odd quality about it is I haven't talked to these people in a long time. You know what I mean? And so I guess I'm already thinking they're not really down, And
Mm.
I do think there is something altruistic and something genuine about, oh my gosh, I'm seeing things in a new way. And there are people who have been around me who are affected by this thing. And I want to reach out and see if they're all right. I do think that there's something altruistic about that. I just, I think the question for me is
Mm-hmm.
is what it is that people are really hoping to accomplish when
Mm.
they do these reach outs. And
Yes.
it relates to something I said on one of our previous shows, is that experiences with racism, especially the most extreme ones,
Oh
they
yeah, yeah.
tend to be very private.
Mm-hmm.
There's usually not a lot of camera phones around. We've had our most racially charged moments.
Mm-hmm.
Like, when I was in Redding, California on tour and we get out to go get a hotel room and we're a bunch of brown people in a tour van and a guy pulls over and in his pickup truck and yells, "Niggers, get out of here." You know what I mean? There weren't any phone cameras around that day, so people didn't really know about it. And so that day, was nobody checking on me. You know what I mean? I had to kind of swallow that experience myself and process it. So I just wonder if people think about that while they're reaching out. Just how many experiences people might have had that there was no check-in for.
Yeah, and I'm willing to talk about that, I guess is what I'm saying. Because people are going to drop off and it lets me know who's going to actually be my real friend in the end.
I hear
Because
that.
I expect the same thing from my friends. I'm ignorant about experiences I don't personally have. I'm not a woman or I'm not queer, and so my friends that have that experience can speak to that when it comes up. I'm not
Sure.
going to badger them about it because they're my friends and I just want to hang out, you know. When you're hanging out with your friends, you're not like, tell me about your experience all the time. It's like, hey, what'd you think of that movie we just saw? you
Mm-hmm.
know? So, but to know people who have different experiences than you and to know them and love them means at some point, yes, of course you're going to talk about the real shit. That's part of what it means to have a relationship with someone, whether it be romantic or friendship, right?
Yeah,
Point is that there's a lot of work to be done, right? And it's not
absolutely.
just, it's external and it's internal. So they both kind of like, I think that that's a big thing is that the relationship between those two things, what's happening with us internally and what's happening in the country externally, is becoming clearer and clearer.
That
You know what
makes
I mean?
sense. That
Because,
makes
like you
sense.
said, racism is an internal thing.
It
It
is.
happens, and then we internalize it, and it's true for anybody who's experienced depression or prejudice or hatred. They internalize it, right?
Absolutely.
So in some way, but we also live in a country that has internalized it in the structures of the
Institutionally.
country
Absolutely.
institutionally. So there are a lot of white people who have been doing this work, and have been talking about this work for a long time. Um, and even people who are new to this work but willing, and that's what I'm asking my white friends to be willing. You know what I mean? And I'm not here to praise you, I guess, and to pat you in the back and say you're one of the good ones. I'm here to really challenge you, as I would expect you challenge me on my bullshit.
That's
How else
good.
am I supposed to grow,
You
right?
know, you know what I think I'm about to do? The next time one of my white acquaintances checks on me, I'm just gonna forward it to you. Just have you challenge them. You know what I mean? Because you want to challenge them.
CC Baron Vaughn on this email. He's got some things to say to you. Me, I'm going to be hanging out with my son, not talking to you. That's fantastic. Well, that's going to bring us into our episode, I think. So we're going to bring in our first guest in a split second. And, I hate to say the phrase that this person needs no introduction. They technically don't, but I'm going to let this clip right here introduce this person for us.
But the people who are doing the most in this country to get at the root problems are behind bars. And that those of us who are not doing important enough work to put us behind bars must do everything we can to get the people that are there out. But I'm not here to talk about who I am and where I'm coming from. I'm here to talk about people whose lives are at stake. I am white, and I am a movie actress. I risk much less. The jails of this country are overflowing with people whose only crime is to be black and free and spreading the word around to free other people. And this is something that everyone has to become very aware of.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the meme says, in a world full of Karens, become a Jane. Please welcome to Call and Response, Jane Fonda. How you doing, Jane?
Doing okay, Baron. Interested in listening to you, both of you talking.
You're doing okay listening to both of us talking?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm glad that's the least I can ask for, at least. I didn't want you to be like, I'm leaving. I'm out of here. Well, we just showed this clip of you
What was
from
it saying? I couldn't hear.
Yes. Well, you were basically talking about the struggle. You're talking about the struggle, and you're talking about that. You were proclaiming yourself a white movie star who is using your platform to shine a light, on people who are actually going through something, as opposed to what you're going through something, which is something that you have been doing for a really long time. Putting your money where your mouth is. Putting your body where the trouble is. Not only from your activism in terms of civil rights, but also your environmental activism, which both are about human rights, ultimately. So that's what, we want to talk to you about today, is just your lifelong work as an activist, and kind of what you think about that. So in terms of like racial politics, what sort of turned the light on for you about those things, and what does that mean to you to if you will be an ally to Black people?
Whoa, what turned the light on? I grew up out here in California, and I didn't have a lot of contact with Black people. But then when I was 10, we moved to a corporate community called Greenwich, Connecticut.
Oh yes.
First time I heard the word kike, and the first time I heard the N-word. And one day I said the N-word in front of my father, and he slapped me in the face. It's the only time he ever hit me. And he said to me, "Don't you ever, ever use that word again." Well, I adored my dad, and I knew he had a lot of integrity. So the fact that that was the time that he hit me made me really start thinking about why does, it's when I became aware of what racism was about. And then I got to know quite a few Black people, and they became my friends. In fact, speaking about, when you're a celebrity and have a platform, I remember 1970 when I was just beginning to become an activist, and I hated the fact that my celebrity separated me from the people that I was organizing, basically, in Detroit. And I was friends with Kenny Cockrell, who was the head of the League of Revolutionary Black Lawyers. And he had a huge influence on me. And I said, "Kenny, I think I'm going to quit Hollywood." And he said, "Fonda, the movement has enough organizers. We don't have movie stars. You can't quit. You have to not only not quit, you have to start taking your career seriously, and start being very intentional about your work." And so that's when I became a producer. For quite a number of years, I was very involved with the Panthers and with a number of Black organizations.
You can't watch a documentary about the Black Panthers without seeing you in it. to be honest, I'm like, oh, there's Jane again. There's Jane again.
It was interesting, but to tell you the honest truth, I have an adopted Black daughter whose parents were Black Panthers. It was in 2016 when Trump was elected that I realized that I didn't know near enough about the history of racism in this country, starting with the beginnings of slavery all the way through the whole journey. And so I've spent about 3 years really like I was in school, reading everything I could get my hands on, including stuff about white privilege. And I think it's really important for white people to do that because you realize all the different aspects of racism and how it's affected people of color. And I mean, I feel like I'm very much a work in progress, but I'm so grateful that I made that determination. I didn't go to my Black friends to say, what should I do? I just started studying.
Mm.
And most helpful to me was the studying I've done about the meaning of white privilege. And I understand why a lot of very, very poor white people who are having a very hard time of it say, wait a minute, what are you talking about? I don't have privilege. They don't understand how skin color has played a role. And so what I've realized is, you said this just now, Baron, there's the internal individual work, and then there's the external work. It's the difference between saying I'm not racist and I'm an anti-racist. Because if you want to be an anti-racist, it involves doing something, action. And one of the values for me of having studied and continuing to study the history of racism and all the different manifestations that racism has played in this country is how important it is that we start, and I hope it happens soon, we start dealing with all of the policies that hold Black people back. Why it is that it's almost impossible for Black people to develop wealth, cross-generational wealth, which, like home ownership, like where you live, all those kinds of things. There's so many policies that are part and parcel of this, what we call a democracy, that have to be gotten rid of. And I think, I think that once those things are done away with, and Black people and all people of color begin slowly to be able to play on a somewhat leveling playing field, white people who are scared of that are not going to be scared anymore. I think, because when things begin to even out, it'll just become, oh, it's okay. It's okay, and but I feel like my job is to talk to white people, and a lot of white people have been coming to me, and I think that's good. And and having compassion for those white folks who just don't understand yet. But they, you've got to be taught to hate and fear, right? It starts from the beginning, and it's scary for people who are afraid of things they don't know and that they're not familiar with. And I think that's up to us white people to do something about. And I am so frigging excited about what is happening in the streets right now. Open mic, you're so right. It's an unprecedented amount of diversity. There are communities here in California with no Black people living in it. And yet you see multi-generational white folks marching with Black Lives Matter signs. That's different.
You had said that the election of Trump kind of lets you know that even for as long as you've been doing this work, that you needed to do it at that point in a different way. What was it about his election that kind of activated you to start digging in and studying the way you did?
For one thing, I realized what an incredible racist backlash there was to Obama's presidency.
Yeah.
I had not been aware of that. How much a whole lot of white people couldn't stand the fact that there was an African-American president. So that took me aback. And then just the folks started coming out of the woodwork. And the stuff that he talked about and the way that the whole tenor of his rallies made me realize that white supremacy was way more robust than I realized it was. And that's what made me start to study. And oh, I've just enjoyed it. It's so, I mean, like the warmth of other suns, for example, the history of the Great Migration when
Great
Black
book.
began to move was so interesting. And especially Black biographies, when you can really kind of see everyday life through the eyes of a Black person and what it feels like, and how parents talk to their children about how to keep your head down and not get shot and blah blah blah. You know, you can't know that unless you read about it, I think.
Mm. I want to switch gears, even though I'm not really switching gears, because, one of the things I respect about you is that you have a rap sheet, and your rap sheet reads as a list of things that you care a lot about, because you've spent a lot of time in the last year actually getting arrested over and over and over again, for Fire Drill Fridays. And as well, you've been arrested in other situations in which you were standing up for different causes. But, I want to talk about what's going on with climate change, the environment, whatever the most appropriate way to talk about it is called these days, because I do feel that not only is it an important issue for literally everyone, but that people of color around the globe are going to be the first people affected by what is happening. And so, there's a lot of people who they have a hard time seeing the threat of this as immediate as it actually is. And also seeing it that it is still just like the fight for, humanitarian rights. All of it is still about us as a planet and us, as creatures that need to continue to live. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that, about your environmental work. And I did want to talk to you about, like, I already mentioned, like, the environmental work will affect communities of color disproportionately. So I wanted you to be able to expand on those ideas if possible.
Well, I think it's true to say that the climate crisis that is before us, this existential moment in human history when we have barely a decade to make fundamental changes to our society, or things are going to start unraveling that are beyond our control. It is the greatest injustice. It's it's it, it's a humanitarian injustice because it hits the people who had the least to do with causing it and who
Mm-hmm.
least defend themselves, from Africa and India and East Asia and South America and Central America and Black and brown communities in this country I mean, here's something that I didn't know until we started the Fire Drill Friday rallies in DC, and I began to study. Um, in 87, a report came out that showed for the first time that it's very deliberate when fossil fuel companies put their oil wells and their fracking pits and their refineries and incinerators in communities of color and low-end communities on indigenous lands. It is deliberate because they know that those people don't have the power to fight back when they begin to die from cancer and heart disease and lung disease. And they feel that the people who do have the power won't care about them. And so they do it, they feel, with impunity. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a large proportion of the people that joined me in DC on Fire Drill Fridays were people of color who live in those communities. And the stories are horrendous about what those people are experiencing right now. So, I mean, other people see climate crisis as something way off in the future. For a whole lot of people, and mostly people of color, it is happening right now
It's here.
in
Yeah.
our communities.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why more people of color are dying from COVID-19, because they
Yes.
already start off at a terrible disadvantage. But you know what just breaks my heart? It's not just because of that they're dying. I have a friend, she's an environmental activist, she's a Black woman, in Lowndes County, Alabama, and she told me that in Montgomery, the hospitals are filled up. There are no more ventilators. There are no more masks. The health professionals are just, they're overworked and they're crying for help. All the patients are Black. And there was a vote in the city council about whether to it's spiking in Montgomery. And all of the Black members of the city council voted yes, let's wear masks. All the white people voted no.
Wow.
So sacrifice zones are, not just in the Cancer Valley in Louisiana, and it's also, COVID is showing us sacrifice zones. Nothing's being done about what's happening with COVID in prisons because they're largely people of color. The attitude with this administration is let them die. So right before our eyes right now, we are seeing an assault on people of color that's deliberately not being addressed.
So much of what we end up talking to people about is the work that they're doing, and whether it's people protesting for Black Lives Matter, whether it's authors we have on, so much of an important and usually unspoken part of their work is about reimagining the world. And you have a project called Create for Earth, and one of the thrusts of it is encouraging people to reimagine how we engage with the planet. Can you tell us more about the mission for Create for Earth?
Well, I'm friends with a feminist artist in Chicago, and a guy who in London, who's a big deal in the art world. And we decided, during the Great Depression in the 30s, Roosevelt gave tens of millions of dollars to support artists, and art just flourished.
WPA.
Yeah, I did two things. It showed the face of the suffering in the Depression, but it also showed a vision of what could be. And so Judy and I decided that we needed to encourage people to create art that would do the same thing. Now, they're not getting government support right now, but maybe one day. But so that's, art that can be put on walls and billboards and placards and things like that. And young and old people are submitting their artwork, because artists have always been, this is a moment for artists, because we're in a moment of an existential crossroads, a moment of transition. And artists, more than anyone, and I'm talking about novelists, poets, actors, painters, sculptors, the full gamut of artists are the best ones to show us what's possible, to open our minds to things that we may not be aware of, and so that's why we did Create Art for the Earth.
That's fantastic. Create Art for Earth is the name of the organization. Yeah, because, and I did want to ask you, and I guess it's my last question, and kind of ties everything together that we're talking about, because I keep hearing every single day, anytime I listen to the news, even if it's financial news, people are evoking World War II, left and right. People are saying this pandemic, this is the first time this has happened since World War II. Such and such shut down since World War II. They changed the date for the first time since World War II, because this is a global crisis that is happening, the pandemic. It's immediate. Climate crisis is also a global crisis, but people go like, that's in the future, even though it's here. But pandemic is like thrust into our face. And so with World War II, with the period after the Great Depression, there were long periods of artists doing very interesting things, like post Great Depression, post World War II. A lot of my favorite art, writing, plays, all that stuff come from those eras, because the world was fundamentally different and our priorities had shifted, whether we liked it or not. And people were trying to process that. So it's really beautiful that you are intentionally, going forward with that idea. And I guess that's what I'm thinking about. Like, what are some of the things, so because even like the phrase Green New Deal, that evokes FDR, right? And you just talked about FDR, the New Deal a little bit with what was happening after World War II. So I guess I wanted to ask you, about like what are some of the things, you know, under the banner of something like a quote unquote Green New Deal, what are some of the things that you would be interested to see happen or develop that you think would be helpful for us as a country? Like kind of fantasy programs, if you could just have your druthers.
Fantasy.
You want me to give you an example?
Yeah.
Okay. Here's one. Talk about technology, right? A lot. I think about technology a lot where we're going. You know, I think that we as a country, we spend a lot of money on weapons, on military. And when it comes to AI and robotics, we spend a lot of time spending money on things to kill people faster from a farther distance. But that's because that's an extension of the priorities of the people making those decisions. So in my fantasy situation, you know, people of color are involved in deciding what kinds of technologies, you know, we develop, and developing technologies that would help replenish the earth as opposed to just continuously take from it, like fracking. That's a thing for me that I'm like, can we develop something like that, you know, where we have an intentionality to the kind of tech that we make that helps us as a country step off how we use energy and stuff like that. So that's like a, you know, I'm only talking concepts, and that's kind of what I mean. I don't mean it's like it's got to be exactly this. I'm asking you to be fanciful.
Yeah. I'm not a fanciful kind of gal.
I would disagree. I've worked with
Why
you a
I'm
little bit
not
now.
very funny. Um, you know, I'm so acutely aware of the very specific things that have to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Very relatively short period of time, 9.5 years. I'm talking about what the scientists tell us. If
Mm.
anything the pandemic should have taught us is the importance of paying attention to the experts, you know, scientists and medical experts. What has to happen is we have to cut our fossil fuel emissions in half. And there's no technology that is going to be ready and scaled up in time to enable that to happen. It has to be who we elect to office, and our ability to go into the streets in numbers 5 times bigger than what we're seeing right now, and forcing governments on the federal and state and local levels to stop all fossil fuel development. That's what has to happen. That's the number one. If we don't do that, it's kind of going to be out of our hands, and we're going to see an unraveling of the ecosystem that we depend on to survive.
Yeah, if anybody thinks it's chaos in the streets right now, you know,
Well, you
that's
know,
why.
one of the things that excites me so much about Fire Drill Friday is that a large numbers of the people. I mean, last Friday we had over 100,000 people tuned in to our show. We've had as high as 250,000 people.
That's amazing.
And so a lot of them have never been involved with protests before. And so this is what we were hoping would happen, because we need new people, not just every people who are used to. And this is why I'm so excited, open mic, with the fact that a lot of the people that are joining these marches right now are new to protest. And we have to encourage that more and more and more.
If I could
The
ask you one more.
scientists are telling us this. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. If I could ask you one more quick question. I was reading a piece about your history of activism, and there was a part in it where you were reflecting on protesting Nixon and protesting Vietnam. And you had this quote where you were saying, "It was a very tumultuous and polarized time. There was a lot of anger and blame. For myself, I didn't always know how to channel my anger in constructive ways." And speaking to what you were just saying, there's a lot of angry people right now. And what would you say are some constructive ways that they can channel their anger right now?
Well, let me just say the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter and all the other organizations that are part of the movement for Black Lives are really showing us the value of nonviolent protest. And I think following the leadership of the movement for Black Lives is the way to go. A lot of them are Black queer women. And I personally think that that fact in and of itself is part of what makes this time that we're living through different. You know, the Panthers, it was very much a Black men
Mm-hmm.
leading. Well, it was a whole different approach to protest. So I think that the best thing, the way that people can channel their rage is to follow the lead of the movement for Black Lives.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's a wonderful leadership. And I just, I several years ago I got flyers in the mail, how to keep yourself well and healthy from Black Lives Matter. I thought, I've never gotten anything like this from any organization. And that was before I realized that it was headed by women. That kind of, we have to look out for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We have to take time for ourselves and our families. More than ever, we have to stay healthy because we're so important, right?
Yeah, we had the honor.
That's the way to go. Yeah.
We had the honor of having one of the founders, Patrice Collars, on, and she said collective care is the way that she put it, and that flyer that you got is a perfect example of that. Everybody, that was Jane Fonda. Thank you so much for being here, Jane.
I really encourage people to read Patrice Cullors' book, When They Call You a Terrorist, because it really gives a bird's eye, very personal and extremely moving view of what it means to be a Black woman in this country right now. And because her brother has mental health issues and what has been done to him in prisons. And I've been working with her on reform LA jails. And so I encourage that They Call Me a Terrorist. That and Ta-Nehisi Coates' biography are two recommended readings.
Yes, indeed.
Also, another one called White Fragility for folks watching this who are white.
Right. Robin DiAngelo. Jane Fonda, everybody.
That was amazing. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you very much. Jane Fonda, check out check out Fire Drill Fridays. Obviously, check out Create Art for Earth. Check out Grace and Frankie on Netflix. Check out the documentary about Jane. Check out, one of the worst things about working with Jane Fonda is that literally everybody wants to know what Jane Fonda's like. That's like the number one question. It's like, what's Jane like? And one of the things that I always say is, someone once told me there's a difference between demanding respect and commanding respect. And I said, Jane commands respect.
That's amazing.
That's one of the things that I appreciate about her is her inability to suffer fools. It's a great quality. And then she gets playful. She said that she wasn't fanciful. I've seen it happen on set every now and then. She likes to cut up and have a laugh as well. So sorry, everybody, to burst the bubble. Well, we are going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to have our good friend, comedian, and activist, Nato Green.
Whoa, Baron.
Yes.
So look,
yes,
I don't work on Grace and Frankie, so I don't get to talk to Jane Fonda all the time.
Oh yeah, okay.
That was wild.
Yeah, you got a little taste of what my life is like. People are just kind of like, what's that like being around Jane? I'm like, it's actually pretty cool. We don't get, like I said, we don't get to talk shit like that on set because we're, there to do a job. But obviously I've know what she stands for.
Right.
Usually I sit back and listen because when she is talking politics on set, it's with Lily and Martin Sheen and Sam Waterston, who also have interesting ass shit to say. So I'm just like, I don't want to go in there and be like, actually, I just got to sit back and listen and then, silently judge. But how'd you feel about the interview, man?
Thought it was fantastic, man. All of that wealth of actual real life feet on the ground protest experience. And I was so fascinated that she's had such a recent pivot to how she's gone about things. Like, you just typically, people get set in their ways.
Yes.
And it's so rare, first of all, to see somebody like, the 60s and the 70s were a very active time for protesting, and not many people who were using their platform for that back then still do to this day. And for her to not only keep doing it, keep at it, but then to be aware of how to adapt in the modern era, how to do it differently and make it even more focused and acute. I think that's really, really fascinating and really, really inspiring.
And it seems that the key, everybody, is keep listening to people. Keep listening and keep, don't be complacent with your need to feel that you know everything. You know what I'm saying? Which I think actually our next guest is also a perfect example of that, because it's kind of a big deal to us in a sense, because we don't get to hear white people often talk about shit in the way that Jane does. I think there's a handful of white people across this planet that talk about these issues in ways that I'm like, obviously she mentioned the book White Fragility. Robert DiAngelo is a person. This woman Jane Elliott's been getting a lot of play a lot lately on the internets about what she had to say about the indoctrination of how we see race in this country. So to us, it's refreshing in a sense to hear white people talk about this. But when I talk to those white people about how did you come to this conclusion, they always say it's simple. It's like, I just know that everything can't be about me, and that that it's about all of us, and that so it's like they kind of, and this person who we're going to bring up kind of describes it in that sort of a way. But we're going to actually go to a clip in which he describes it, because speaking of dual identities, Jane is actually she's an actor, but she's also an activist, which this country has a very strange relationship with those two dual identities. This next person coming to the stage, the virtual stage, is a stand-up comedian and also an activist and a union organizer, a couple of different hats that he wears that he'll be able to talk about a little bit. But here's a clip from his album, The Whiteness.
And, I've been inspired by Black Lives Matter, and I'm obviously the official spokesperson of all white people. And so and I post a lot of stuff about it. And I don't know if you know this about comedians, but only 20% of the job of a comedian is this raining fire into the microphone that you're witnessing. And 80% of the job of a comedian is arguing with people on the internet. And so I posted stuff about Black Lives Matter, and then I had to deal with the All Lives Matter people, who were like, All Lives Matter people, like, why you gotta say Black Lives Matter? It's All Lives Matter. You're excluding us. I already feel like my life does not matter, and all I had to hang on to is at least my life matters more than black people's lives, and you're taking that away from me. All lives matter. And that is the argument of a crazy person. Because of course all lives matter. It's Black Lives Matter, not Black Lives Matter so your life doesn't matter. We're just talking about black people now because that's how conversations work. You know what I mean? It's the kind of person where you're like, hey man, let me tell you what I had for lunch. No, let me tell you what I had for lunch. Motherfucker, you're gonna get a turn. We can both talk here. Like, that sweater looks very nice on you. Are you saying all other sweaters look bad on me? No. That's not how humans communicate. But it turns out that we're very thin-skinned as a people.
Please welcome to Call and Response, stand-up comedian, labor organizer, co-host of the Bitchuation Room podcast with Francesca.
When will our voice be heard?
Yeah, we waited for as long as we could. I think it was contractually we had to have at least one white man on. I think is what happened.
Yeah. This is basically like our Saved by the Bell episode, where it's like we really focus on a specific issue. That used to happen a lot in 90s sitcoms.
A special episode of
It's a
Call and
very
Response.
special call and response.
Where Lisa Turtle was experiencing racism, and Jesse Spano had to be like, "I'm so scared." So this is our special episode where we focus on the issue of whiteness, which is the name of your album. So Mike, you were gonna ask a question. Now I'm putting you on the spot.
Where'd you record that album? I'm so curious.
I recorded in San Francisco at the defunct nightclub Doc's Lab.
So a San Francisco audience, was a lot of white people in the audience when you recorded that?
Yes, there were. Typical San Francisco. My audience tends to be relatively diverse for San Francisco. One of the funny things about the taping, I've never told anybody this, but at the taping there were a couple of tables of older black folks that sat right in front and like made it a point to like clap and like, to like be super into it. They were like, listen, white people, this is approved. You know what I mean? So that helped.
Did you know them? Did you know this group of older black people?
Some yes, some no.
Hmm.
I feel like doing the comedy that you do, which is very funny, but it's also like really stealthy, challenging
Mm-hmm.
for white people. And I imagine in San Francisco, it wouldn't cause too much of a backlash. But I'm assuming you've probably traveled all around doing it, and I'm wondering like, does it ever get like really isolating to be in white spaces? Telling jokes that kind of have this low key intention of like waking white people up.
Um, yeah. Well, I mean, it gets isolating in the sense of like, it's not even that I travel around and I get the backlash. It's like because of the kind of comedy that I do, there's just
People
gigs
already
that
know.
I don't get. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Like, people Google me and they're like, oh, we're not going to book that guy. And certainly, what I run into more is like white people who think that they're liberals who then feel indicted by my act and why you want to do those jokes about killing the rich or whatever, you know,
The white
and
moderate.
the white moderate. So it's those kind of people, but it's also surprising. Like I have people emailing through my webpage or DMing me who are like, "Hey, I heard your comedy, and like I'm getting, and like how do I get involved?" Or what do you recommend I read? Or like some of those people that are
Mm.
bothering you are in my DMs or being like, how do I organize a union in my job? My landlord's trying to evict me. What can I do about it? So like, and particularly in San Francisco, I get a lot of like tech people who are people that I, as a San Francisco native, see as gentrifiers. I see them as gentrifiers, and they'll come up to me after a show and be like, "I feel conflicted about my role in this city, and what should I do?"
Mm.
Um, and
Mm.
so, I'm super happy to like have those conversations. And if it's really important to me that I don't want to be that the kind of comic where like as political as I am as a person, I don't want to be super strident and like you and act like I know, I'm not Bill Maher. I don't. My comedy's not based on the idea that I'm smarter than everybody. Um, so I think like Barron said before, we're Americans. We're all implicated in this corrupt system, and so like my comedy is basically rooted in a sense of optimism
Hmm.
about people, and hopefully that makes it accessible to people who might otherwise feel threatened by it.
Where'd you get these politics?
Well, I grew up in San Francisco. My parents were like 1970s radicals. I grew up going to marches, and I had, I was I was a Jewish kid in the city. Being, I'm that stereotype, like Jewish kid in the city, grew up on the left. Read a lot of books. Uh, like a lot of I had black teachers in elementary school who were incredibly like profound and formative for me. And I was just telling somebody about how my second grade teacher, I was getting bullied a lot, and my second grade teacher gave me this collection of Black History comic books. And it was like suddenly the world made sense to me. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Mm.
and so my experience of like being bullied and being marginalized as a Jewish kid in an inner city public school system, like a lot of Jews, through my own personal dialogue with Black history, that's how I made sense of it. And actually, my dad also worked in the public school district, and there was this older black dude that he worked with who I would still like run into at the grocery store, 30 years later. And literally up until a couple of years ago, I'd run into him in the grocery store and he'd be like, Nathaniel Green, you're the only white fourth grader I ever met who quoted Malcolm X to me out of the blue. So, uh, and then as I got older, I had the good fortune of getting a lot of mentorship from black radicals. Like there was a generation of people who were communists and Black Panthers in the 70s, and learning, having relationships with those people, learning those people from those people had a huge effect. And one of the biggest things about being around those people is that I never had sentimentality about America. Like I never
Mm.
I never got caught up in the illusion of the American dream or how the system's supposed to work or like that. Like, this is not my country. I can't believe that the America that I know wouldn't put children in chains. Well, then you don't know what America is. And so, when you spend time around black radicals, when you spend time around like the first generation of AIDS activists who survived the early days of the AIDS crisis, who fought Reagan and won, when you spend time around people who were, have been working with undocumented immigrants in Arizona, and people, and the sanctuary movement from the beginning of the sanctuary movement, there's no, or as I have, like if you spend time in Latin America, I've spent a lot of time in a bunch of different countries in Latin America and learned from, as Baron was saying earlier, are listening to people about what this country has done to them. I was in Guatemala once and this dude said to me, from our perspective as Guatemalans, the only difference between Democrats and Republicans is whether we get murdered or die from starvation. That's the difference. So it's like, having been around that makes it easier to move forward.
So for somebody who's been around activism and the movement as long as you have, does this moment of white activation feel new to you? And if so, why do you think it's happening?
It does feel new. It feels different. Have you ever heard that thing that they talk about, like how scientists study like squid cells because the squid cells are bigger, and so they can see like a exaggerated version of how cellular function is. I feel like Trump is that of whiteness. Do you know what I'm saying? Like Trump is the extreme embodiment of things that are true about all white people, like that we have shit that we don't deserve, we didn't earn, it's not ours, it's not fair, we don't know what to do with it, we don't know how to have the responsibility for it, and now we have to come up with a bunch of bullshit to justify why this situation is okay. And then we make ourselves and everyone around us crazy in our fantasy about justifying why it's okay for us to have a bunch of shit that we don't deserve and didn't earn. And I feel like people see the like grotesque version of that with Trump and are like, oh yikes, am I that guy? I don't want to be that guy. And so I think it's like created this level of opening, and and you can see it in like the press coverage, like when the press coverage turns from like, these are, Antifa radicals protesting, to like, it's just, moms in the suburbs with their children protesting. Like when you see the press covering protesters as being like, no normal people, it's like suddenly it's in the mainstream. And there are these moments, these what movement people used to call the moment of the whirlwind, where suddenly everything is happening and people are in motion and the system is destabilized and there's a possibility of disruption, and we need to like push it open as far as possible, because at some point sort of it will recede a little bit, and there's an opportunity now to gain a lot of ground, and we have to take it.
There's something very specific about I've always been drawn to the Bay Area, and I it's because of the ideas that you're expressing here. Like, I met you through Kamau Bell, and I've always loved San Francisco comedians too. I always thought that people who have come from the Bay Area, San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, etc., have a very specific way of looking at the world because of how different and close those three cities I just named are. They're very close and they're very different from each other, but that's in the history of, I guess, that region of California, and how all those cities have had been studying identity and stuff for a long time, which is a very specific thing. And I guess what I'm aiming at is, you have been very involved in the actual community, in the city that you live in, because you do a lot of union organizing. The other day you were talking about an action that happened at the docks in up there. So, you said it's the whole entire state of California, right?
Yeah, the International Longshore Union, which actually was the first union I was a member of. The ILW has a long and radical history.
You were a longshoreman?
I was not a longshoreman. It's the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. So I joined when I was a car messenger, and I organized a union of biking car messengers into the ILW. So I was a rank and file ILW member at one point. And so the longshoreman has this long and radical history. Like they, there was a point, during the 80s, they refused to unload ships from apartheid South Africa. And in the
Wow.
90s, they shut down all the docks on the West Coast in solidarity with Mumia Abu Jamal. They were one of the first unions to take a principal position about not excluding black people from the hiring hall. And so, that's the history of this union. And so for Juneteenth, they shut down the ports all up and down the West Coast, which, just so it's not, shutting down the ports costs capitalism millions and millions of dollars.
It's really hitting where it hurts for sure.
So I went out to the port of Oakland, and where they shut down the ports, and there were tens of thousands of people out there marching, and we marched from the port to Oakland Police Department to City Hall. And it was incredible, like a huge diversity of people, a mix of rank and file union members, also from my union, so a lot of city workers as well, and young people and radicals and bicycle brigades, and it was an amazing movement. And one of the things one of my big messages, I guess, points that I want white people to contemplate is that.
That is my next question. What do you want white people to contemplate?
Let me tell you what I want white people to contemplate is that we need to be able to contain complex and contradictory thoughts at the same time. And so one of them, it is true that, as Jane was saying, that the coronavirus and climate change reflects racial disparities, and people of color are going to get the worst of it. It is true that it is an injustice. It is true that the suffering that is inflicted on people of color by systemic racism is a moral abomination, and it's our responsibility to stop it. And it is also true that that's not just a matter of empathy and compassion, but that from my perspective, I don't think of myself particularly as an ally.
Right, you have a problem with that word.
My anti-racism is about my own liberation and my own humanity. Like the idea that I have a personal stake in ending racism. It's not just something that I'm doing to be nicer to people of color, but like my kids go to public schools, and the public school system is fucked up because of racism. You know what I mean? Like California has a drought, and so it's getting harder and harder for us to get food, and we have entire cities burning down because of climate change that is getting aggravated because of racism, right? So like and just even I live in a segregated city where San Francisco used to be 12% black, and now it's 5% and dropping, maybe 4%. And that's not even evenly distributed. Like the black community is primarily concentrated in homeless shelters and in the jails. And so it's like, what kind of damage, how is my life diminished that I live in a city where my main exposure to black people is homeless people, because the black community in the city has been destroyed. Like, that's not good for me. It's not good for me to miss out on having opportunities to connect and learn and grow and have my ideas and perspective challenged. So I really want, I sort of am resistant to the privilege conversation, because it suggests that I get a benefit, and the benefit that I get, it's true that I don't get followed by security guards, and that's nice, and it's true that my credit score is good, and that's nice. But it's also like that compared to the consequences, both for my humanity as a person and the material conditions of my life, that I live in a racist society and I tolerate its and that white people in general are complicit in its reproduction, that we all have a stake at ending that.
Wow. Yeah, I thought you was gonna come in here cracking jokes, man. That's a lot of
You
knowledge.
didn't laugh the entire time. I was laughing the entire time.
No, I had to have my serious face. We had a white man
exactly.
on. Can't show him.
Well, sometimes Nato just likes to speak, and that is kind of a thing for all of us. I think we have to articulate what we really think before we can turn it into the joke or the song and stuff like that. However, if you out there are like, I thought this guy was a comedian, you are correct, and you should check out his album, The Whiteness. And for now, thank you very much, Nato Green.
That was really dope, man. Thank you for coming and bringing all that perspective.
Any shout outs you want to give?
Shout out to the people in the streets.
Shout out to the people in the street. You heard it from Nato Green. Thank you very much, Nato. Well, we have reached the end of another episode, I guess. Not the finish, because we have one more guest.
Okay, I was confused.
There's a guest, and then we're done. I'm just saying we hit the home stretch. I don't know what I'm saying anymore, actually.
Oh, well, that's good. At least you're lucid and aware of that.
Oh, I have to be lucid and aware of something. You know, if I don't know how to, describe things, I need to be lucid that I don't know how to describe things.
That's pretty cool, man. I could have talked to Nato for another hour, man. He was really bringing some points. I really like that humanist perspective.
Absolutely, that's
really
becoming
like
a bigger theme here.
Yeah, and I don't hear a lot of like a lot of the writers who I really enjoyed, Kurt Vonnegut, Robert Anton Wilson. These are white men.
Yes.
That wrote from a humanist perspective. Tom Robbins, and that, I don't know. I feel like that got imbued into me some, and so that's part of my core. So it's nice to hear those ideas because they get those wheels turning for me again.
Yeah, actually, the pandemic made me remember this. Something I heard Kurt Vonnegut say on some interview a long time ago, something to the effect of, we are a virus and it's no wonder that Mother Nature's immune system is trying to purge us. That's how he opened the interview.
Oh, he's so bomb.
I was like, I think I did that. But right now we're going to bring in a guest that is, I would describe as the opposite of me doing which is just a very silly sound and means nothing and speaks to nothing. But the next guest that is coming on to our lovely show here has written a book called The Future of Whiteness. She is a doctor and a professor doctor. She said that they say in Germany. She is a professor of philosophy at Hunter College. One of her students is one of my other favorite philosophers, Maisha Cherry, which is how I discovered her. A friend of mine had turned me onto a podcast called Partially Examined Life, and I had heard Maisha Cherry on not that podcast, and had heard her say that she had a podcast called Unmute, and I started listening to that podcast, which hard vouch anyone out there. Unmute is one of my favorite, if not the favorite podcast of mine in the world, because Maisha is doing something. Her premise with this podcast is to make philosophy something that's very applicable, to remind people that philosophy is something that's applicable to society. There is a kind of a thing that happens with all arts and all disciplines when we take it to academia. A writer used to say, when you canonize something, you kill it. You know what I mean? You decide that there's a group of people who are name brand philosophers, and you, philosophy major, are to know who these people are and what their contribution was, right? As opposed to teaching the skills of critical thinking and how to create arguments and develop arguments and about what's happening in the world. You know what I mean? So there's that thing that happens sometimes, I guess, and our guest could speak to that. So Maisha's, her premise to the point of Unmute is to talk to philosophers that are talking about issues that are happening in the world that will be useful for people like me and Open Mike Eagle to be able to apply them to how we live our lives and how we make our art. And so without any further ado, I would like to welcome to call and response Linda Martín Alcoff. Hello. I greeted you like Tyler Perry. In the middle, I did the whole thing about whiteness. And I was like, oh, hello. How you doing, Linda?
I'm good. Happy to be here.
Oh, yes. Happy to have you here. Mike, do you want to start us off here?
Yeah, just as a general question, as something I've seen watching a few videos of you talk to people about what it is that you study. It seems to me that there is a certain almost unspoken difficulty in you being a white presenting person speaking to other white people about the concept of whiteness. I've seen a lot of what looks like psychological resistance from the people that you speak to. And I'm wondering, what is your sense of that? And if that's something that you feel like you can explain some.
Yeah, sure. I should explain my background because I was born in Panama to a white mother and a brown father, a Panamanian father. And I came to the United States as an immigrant, as a young child in Florida, and grew up. And so I'm, I'm mixed. I've got a mixed family. I'm the lightest member of my siblings. I got my mother's coloring. And so I have, I certainly passed in most places in the United States, and I've thought some about how white privilege works. But there's actually a number of people like me who are light skinned, who are kind of on the periphery, who are on the margins. I think a lot of, Jewish identities sometimes work like this, like sometimes you're on the right side of whiteness and sometimes you're on the wrong side of whiteness. So it's a perspective out there that can generate some reflection and some interesting experiences. Some light-skinned Latinas have written about how actually it's kind of hard because Anglos will say things in front of you that are painful. And so what do you do in that situation? Sort of, if you're a theorist, you want to take it in. It's an advantage to get to hear what they say when they think they're talking in a safe situation. But I've certainly had to deal with this throughout my life and schooling, and when I saw the situation my sister had when we both came from Panama, and she was not seen as white as easily as I am. So I grew up seeing that, and it's painful. So you realize, and you also realize, from an early age, the craziness of it. My sister and I, you're the most genetically similar to your sibling, even more so than you are to your parents or your children. So, we're very close, but she was put in a different category. And I just knew from a gut level early on, this is just whack.
For lack of a better word, yeah, whack as fuck. I'll elaborate for you on that one. So one of your fields of study in philosophy, would you say it's correct to say it falls under the banner of critical race theory?
Yes.
So this is a thing that was new to me when I discovered it. Start listening to Unmute and then finding all of these guests, you included, reading your work, becoming familiar with your work, so I wanted to ask you about what the field of critical race theory is, and then I want to be able to transition into your work in that field. But can you give us kind of a little primer, because this is a thing I feel like is not being talked about as much in the mainstream, I guess, critical race theory.
Well, there's a lot of work on race by theorists and philosophers that goes way back to the 19th century, and Du Bois and further.
Yes.
But what we think of as critical race theory today is really something that emerged post-civil rights. And it's where people are looking at, civil rights won a lot of very significant reforms, equal employment, and an end to overt Jim Crow segregation and so forth. And yet, look what happened. Mass incarceration is worse than ever. It's more racialized, if that's possible. Housing is terrible. Education is terrible. The wage floor is unlivable, and it adversely affects Black and Latinx populations more so. So critical race theorists are actually looking at how did this happen and what constrained the public discourse, what constrained the reforms that could be made in the law. Why didn't government respond in the way that all the experts told them? There were all these great reports that were made of this. If you want to deal with this problem, you do this, this, and this. And none of it happened. So it's focused since the 1970s, since the 1980s, on criticizing the way reforms were done before. Not to criticize the reformers, because they were working with what they had, but to figure out how we can understand the situation better, change the public arena of discourse, improve it, and get at the root and make real change.
Just real quickly, I know, Baron, you had a follow up to that, but I wanted to touch on something you just said. You said that part of what you study is what constrained the public discourse around race. What elements of that public discourse do you feel like have been missing?
Whiteness, which is why I'm glad you're talking about this, because I think that there's been massive amounts of avoidance and denial of talking about whiteness, how to understand what whiteness is, and what has been the history of this country in relationship to government set-asides, state-sanctioned set-asides for European immigrants vis-a-vis others. And, you know, I think the left in this country doesn't want to talk about it because they think it's a diversion from class. A lot of leftists still don't understand how to put race and class in the same sentence.
Right.
And liberals don't want to talk about it either. And I think what's going on with liberals a lot of times is they think, you know, it's like going home to your family Thanksgiving dinner and you know your uncle's a rabid racist and you just don't want to poke the bear. You know, you don't want to raise the topic because you know he'll go off and it'll be really uncomfortable. So you don't raise it. And so liberals, including the Democratic Party for the most part, have engaged in a lot of avoidance, and they're terrified that if they start talking about race, white people will change the patterns of their voting.
Mm-hmm.
So we haven't had the discussion. You know, and this goes way back. I mean, Thomas Jefferson thought that when slavery was abolished, which he believed would happen, that Black people would have to go back to Africa because there was no way to create a democracy that would be functional and include people who had been harmed as much as Jefferson knew. They had been harmed to the extent they had been harmed, together with this other population, a lot of which had gotten advantages from those harms. How do you create a democracy like that? It's interesting because in Latin America, there were some leaders like Simón Bolívar who took this up.
Mm-hmm.
Said, oh, wow, we have independence now from Spain. How do we do this? How do we create a democracy with the formerly enslaved, with indigenous populations that experienced terrible stolen lands, etc., and mestizo, you know, settlers? How do we do this? We have never really taken that on as a political project in the country in an overt, concerted, institutionalized way. And so I think, you know, key to that is talking about whiteness. And, you know, you can't avoid the topic of how whiteness has been protected and constructed in the history of this country.
Yeah, for me, I think a key reason that people don't want to talk about whiteness is because people don't want to talk about history, and people don't want to be honest about the events that actually transpired to make this country become this country, and the things that have been embedded, I guess, in not only our law, but, you know, the structures of all of our different institutions. And so I wanted to speak to you a little about the function, I guess, of whiteness. So first of all, I guess I want to ask, what's whiteness and how does it function?
Well, I think history is key. There's a great line from the anti-colonial philosopher Aimé Césaire who says, forgetting is a form of cowardice. You know, so I think whiteness is not just a top-down manipulative construction from the state. It's often portrayed that way. It's, you know, all of our identities are really connected to big macro historical experiences. The historical experience of anti-Semitism or of slavery or of forced migration. Most of the European immigrants that came to this hemisphere were fleeing absolute destitution, sometimes religious bigotry, but that was a particular experience of immigration, migration from Europe. And every white family has some lore about why their family came, where their family came from, what their family was motivated by. And Latinx families as well have stories about how they ended up in the United States. So these big historical experiences inform the way we interpret new events, the way we feel about the flag, the way we, notice certain things in our school textbooks, what stands out for us, and the emotions and fears we may feel and experience to certain topics getting raised. So I think whiteness is a historically produced experience as well as a top-down, state orchestrated set of privileges. And I wanted to say that the white half of my family is Southern and poor. And so I've thought a lot about the differences within the category of whiteness. And sometimes it's hard to figure out how to talk about that. And we need this big category of whiteness, but we also, like with every other category,
Mm-hmm.
be able to think about the different experiences that people have. And if you go to a Walmart where my mother lives, you don't see a lot of privilege. You see a lot of, people who are really struggling. But what I learned growing up, I lived with this part of the family for a while, is that even at the very lowest rung of the white ladder, of the economic ladder, my grandparents were sharecroppers in the South. And the only meat that my mother ate growing up was what they could shoot or catch.
Mm.
But, my grandfather, they could go out in the woods with a rifle and shoot some game. And that wasn't possible all the time for Black people in Florida. Some parts of Florida they could, but, that wasn't always necessarily possible. And also my white family homesteaded. They came from Ireland, penniless, illiterate, but they got some land from the government. And so even at the lowest rung of the ladder, there have been advantages. It doesn't mean that people at that level are living good. My family, the homesteading didn't make them rich, but it gave them some financial security and some dignity. And those possibilities were denied Black people.
In the history of public discourse around race, and the fact that has largely been absent, I think one of the effects of that is that you don't really get a sense of how people feel about race, about the race that they are that they quote unquote belong to, or other races in the system. You just don't really get a sense because we don't often on a large scale talk about these things in an honest way. And I wonder if because of that, if you were at all surprised about the feeling of a rising of white nationalism after Obama's presidency. Was that something that came to you as a surprise, or was it something that you had been aware of and had been somewhat suspecting?
Well, I've been following that since I did some anti-Klan activism in the 1970s, and we beat back the Klan through a variety of legal and street methods. And what happens is it just transforms itself. It just creates new avenues and new languages. It's never gone away because it's never really been dealt with. It's never really been addressed in the educational system or in the laws. So it's constantly just morphing into new forms, on taking advantage of 4chan and 8chan, and developing this new language, like Richard Spencer, who poses himself as this kind of intellectual who's just for white people, but not against others, even though he says horrific things against others in reality. So it's not a surprise to those of us who follow this. It's always interesting to see what their new language is and how they reach. They reach a lot of young students, philosophy majors on Long Island, who are not always white, and they like certain libertarianism among the white nationalists, and they like the idea that you will assert your desire to be with others who are like you. So it's not a surprise. What's happened now is, of course, that we have a white nationalist at the White House, and that's a game changer. Not that I think the ones before were anti-racist. Obama was anti-racist, but he was pretty damn ineffective. But we now have an avowed white nationalist in the White House, and it's a very dangerous situation.
I did want to talk to you about, I guess, my reading of history. You know, if we can agree on the premise, or that whiteness is a construct, I guess you could say. Which I do want to ask you about what that means, whiteness being a social construct or race being a social construct. But if we can agree on that, my reading of history is that every so often the group of people who proclaim themselves to be white induct a new group into whiteness who had not previously been allowed to be white. Because I do have a lot of, of course, I read this thing called the internet. And so, sometimes I see people being like, but I'm Italian. Italians weren't white, but I'm Irish, or I'm Polish, or and a big specific one is Jewish people. Also, I think Arab people North Africans were sort of classified as white for a while. These identities seem to be reflected with the census, right? And every now and then I feel like I'm not sure if I'm right that the census always introduces new categories that might have not been there before, but which is why that's one of the reasons the census is important. But I guess I'm asking about the function of, or do you agree with me that historically every now and then a new group gets inducted into whiteness, and how that actually functions, like what that does? And then I wanted to kind of speak about whiteness and Jewish identity as well.
Yeah, the last 120 years, you really see the change in whiteness, because Southern Europeans were not included, and Irish were not included, Slavs were not included in the category of whiteness. And then they became officially included to no longer legally discriminate against the Irish in employment and so forth. So it had bite, and it also had ideological force with the public. And it was partly done, the ethnic amalgamation across the whiteness categories was partly done, of course, through anti-blackness, anti-Mexicanness, anti-native. Have a contrast class that then makes the differences among Italians and Germans that are not that significant. You've got this other thing going on that's much more significant. But, so there's a lot of talk today about what's going to be the next border, change around whiteness, and will Latinx folks, will Asian folks, maybe some light-skinned Black folks make it into the category? And I don't think so. I think this is a wrong way to think about it. Asian folks are all over the map economically. They're not all crazy rich. Most of them are not. If you live in New York like I do, they live poor mostly. And even the Chinese population is so huge, you can't really make meaningful economic generalizations about Asians. You include the Cambodians and the Hmong and so forth. Plus, the Asian folks that have made it into the middle class still experience a lot of social exclusion. So they're not treated. And now with COVID, they're like getting vilified as responsible for this pandemic, and they're getting beat up, they're getting spit on, they're getting verbally harassed, even in cities like San Francisco and LA and New York, where there's a lot of Asian populations. So I think, Asians are kind of borderline, but they're not going to be really included into the club. I think Jews are borderline, and I think the Latinx population is really diverse. There's light-skinned folks like me that can be included fine and not make anybody nervous. but most Latinx people in this country cannot pass, right? They're standing on the corner waiting for day labor jobs, you know.
Non-white Hispanic. I believe I've seen that that phrase before.
Yeah. So it's complicated because in Latin America they define race differently. I'm not, by the laws of Louisiana, I'm not white because I'm mixed. My grandmother was from North Africa, but
Got that one drop.
I got that one drop. But it's about color in Latin America. It's not about lineage. And here it's historically it's been about lineage, but on the street or in a store, it's color is the main thing. But I think if you look across all the varieties and differences among the Latinx population, most of them are never going to be accepted as white. So whiteness. Here's what I think is the important question.
Mm-hmm.
We're moving to a situation in the United States where the professional managerial class is multiracial, right? Don't look at the CEOs of the Fortune 500. Look at the human resources managers. Look at the CEOs. Look at the bosses. Look at the people in charge of hiring and firing and nursing homes and hospitals and schools and factories. And it's becoming more multiracial. Like you think about all the South Asian doctors, and so forth. So what is that going to mean? Now, some people think that if you diversify at that level, it's going to trickle down. Not happening, right? The wage scale of nurse aides is not changing because the managers of nursing homes are now people of color. There's too much money to be had from those depressed wage scales in the big, broad bottom of the pyramid of the economy. So I think we're going to have to become a little more sophisticated about how we understand how race works. It's not going to be all white people at the management level, but there's still going to be race disparities in housing, education, livelihoods, prison, and so forth. So we're going to have to develop, race and class analyses to explain this phenomenon.
Mike, were you going to ask something?
I think you're giving us a lot of the answers that of the question that I wanted to ask. But, I'm thinking about your book, The Future of Whiteness. And to me, that brings about the question, what is the future of whiteness as we know it? And I know since it's a whole ass book, that's probably a lot of answer. But I just wondered, to the best that you could give us some brief tidbits. What do you think the future of whiteness is as we know it?
Can I interject right there real quick? I did want to say, because having been following your work for a while, there are a lot of things that you say about whiteness that I see as prophetic. I see in a sense as the signs of why we are in the situation we're in. So I guess to Mike's question, I guess I kind of want to focus that to what is the future of whiteness based on what you see happening in the streets at this current moment.
Right. No, I think it is a sea change going on right now. It's definitely a shift. I think it's not just the numbers of white people who are in the street, and non-Black people in general, I think is significant to see in the street, but also that they're a little bit more clued in about what role they need to play, that they need to be the ones right in front of the police, right? They need to be the ones taking the biggest risks, but not leading, not trying to be the speaker or get the glory. So there's a recognition that it's not just that we're all in this together, we're differently positioned. We have different options and different histories and different knowledges and different experiences. And I hope that this knowledge will continue and will grow in the future so that white people can be part of the rainbow, right? That's what we want. We want to recognition that we're in this country together, but we have different experiences and different possibilities and different histories. And there's power in those differences. There's a real power difference between what options we can bring to the table. So I think what we have to get to is, and what I was arguing in the book, The Future of Whiteness, was against those folks who think, well, whiteness really, it doesn't really mean anything. It's too loose. It's too, it doesn't really address my own moral and political commitments. It's not really relevant to me. It was a product created by the state, and we should get rid of it. But that experience in our family's situation doesn't go away. History doesn't go away. History stays. We've gotten out of the idea that race is biological, and now we're more often thinking of race as historical. And I think history is going to be more long lasting than biology, right? Because it doesn't go away. You still have pain. If you're a person, you celebrate the release from slavery from 2,000 years ago. People still draw lessons from it and still experience, sadness about it. And what's happening in this country is like happening right now. So I don't think that the reason why we have a polarization in this country is really because there's a polarization among whites. People of color don't disagree. They disagree over tactics. They don't disagree over strategy or goals. White people are in heavy, you look at any opinion polls, it has really changed from the time I was a kid in the 60s. White people are split on race, on the amount of racism we still have, on solutions. And I don't think that means that we're going to turn that 50% of whites into 90%. I think that's the wrong way to understand it. But I do think that changes the possibilities of coalition work, and changes the options we have for how to think about how to move forward politically in this country to win the kind of things that Nato Green was talking about and the kind of things Jane Fonda was talking about earlier. I mean, like, why, just this last example I'll give you, besides the fact we don't have universal health care and we have such a low wage floor, also guns. A lot of white people would like to get some serious gun reform. Why can't we get serious gun reform? Race has everything to do with it. By 2042, you're going to have a white minority. It's going to be the biggest minority, but it's still going to be below 50%. You have a white minority facing off against an amalgam of people of color whose, livelihoods have been adversely affected by the advantages the state has protected for white folks. And I think race and racism is at the center of every challenge we have in our democracy, in every reform for healthcare or for gun legislation that we're trying to address. And white people certainly need to, and some are coming to understand this and coming to see that avoiding the issue of race and racism is going to keep us in a pickle.
Linda Martín Alcoff, everybody. Thank you very much for being here, Linda. It was fantastic talk.
Thanks for your time and your mind. We appreciate it a lot.
Well, I was thrilled to be here with you guys. Love you guys.
Oh, thanks a lot.
Thank you for that.
Love you
so
back.
much.
All right. Linda Martín Alcoff, her book is called The Future of Whiteness. She wrote it a little bit ago, but if you don't know it, go get it.
It's
Please
still
check
whiteness in the future. Even
There's
whether
still-
you pick it up now, pick it up later. It's
There's still a future and there's still whiteness. So
Yeah.
might be applicable. That's it for this episode. My goodness, what a great episode. I'd like to thank all of our guests, Linda Martín Alcoff, Nato Green, and of course, Jane Fonda. Tomorrow we have a fantastic show. It's going to be Jeremiah Ellison, who is the city councilman in Minneapolis that is being very instrumental in a lot of the legislation and actions to defund the police that are happening right there. The homie Diallo Riddle, who is half of Diallo and Bashir.
Another one of our spectacularly talented homies.
Yes, indeed. Diallo Riddle, you might know his show Sherman Showcase or his other show, the South Side. He's going to be here as well, and a hero of mine and Diallo Riddle's, and I think even Open Mike Eagles is going to be here, Mr. Robert Townsend. I cannot believe I get to talk to Robert Townsend tomorrow. So come on down and see it. Shout outs to Funny or Die and Blavity, of course, for letting us do this thing right here in the way that we do it. What a great talk. I mean, a lot of ideas to process. Am I right, Mike?
Yeah, I'm gonna go take a nap. That my brain is lit up 17 ways.
You know, sometimes they say that a nap is like sometimes when you receive information, you might fall asleep. You might go into a dissociative state because your body is like, you know what? I can't be moving. I can't be thinking about elbows and eyeballs while you're hearing this. I'm just going to shut all this shit down so it goes straight into the cortex. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, just the whiteness. A lot. Again, I don't even know what to say because I'm kind of in a tizzy myself. So I guess we'll process some of these things and talk about it as we go on. And for now, that's it. And remember, if you remember, you haven't forgotten.
That's true. Peace.